I wonder if you could explain to me why in the future curating information is going to be so important.
Well, we tend to create a lot of material. We do it every day. As journalists, we think that today is a new day, a chance to get a new scoop, a new exclusive, a new story on the front page. And we tend to forget that everything we produced still has life in it. And beyond that, we've also gathering information from outside. We need to knock down the walls and allow information to come in from outside. This means from readers via comments or from crowdsourced questions. It also means grabbing public data, government data, company data, anything through Freedom of Information Act, and bringing that in and using all that information together to create new wisdom. And the only way we're going to do that is if we're not just thinking in terms of our own stories, but of creating that material, adding metadata to it to make it real and to make it valuable so that hopefully someone somewhere down the line is willing to pay for it.
So it's a question of a sort of a two-way street. So you're working as a journalist or a publisher, you'll be working or incorporating the comments and work of your audience to improve or to create new stories?
Yes, well, I mean, the oft-used term crowdsourcing is a good example. If used properly, we can acknowledge that we are not going to be able to be in more than one place at the same time. We're not going to be able to go through mounds of data, spreadsheet data, at the same time. We're not going to be able to go out and find new ways of looking at stories, new questions, new ways of thinking about leads, of complicated, long-running stories. I'll give you an example. In the Philippines last year, there was a typhoon, and people got together and created map mashups where they would put online on a Google map markers showing where the streets were inundated, the depth of the water, where there were food shortages, where there were problems with sickness and malaria and diarrhea in the early days of the typhoon. That information was being gathered by newspapers and put on their websites. And they were encouraging readers to send that sort of thing in. But it wasn't useful to an individual to find those in different places until activists and journalists got together and said, let's all put this data in one particular place. And so suddenly it became useful to people. They were able to check quickly to see where there were problems and avoid them or go and help them. But then that information comes and has a second life because it then reveals later where there were problems with the infrastructure, where the flood drains didn't work, where the hospitals were not sufficient to be able to cope with the situation, where roads and bridges simply collapsed in the face of this deluge. That is then information that newspapers can use to pressure governments, ministers, politicians into taking action and doing something about it. So when we tend to think of a story as a crisis, as a typhoon problem, instead it becomes an opportunity to create new tools which aggregate all that information which is being brought in by the public, and then later is being pushed back at the government and forcing them to take action. So you have a long-running story that in terms of content is excellent because you're able to regenerate this material, but you're actually also doing something good at the same time.
I know you've got some interesting thoughts on Twitter in particular, not just Twitter, but retweeting, and how that's an important stage in information, in editing, if you like. Is that right?
Yeah, we don't quite yet understand what the phenomenon of Twitter is. My fear is that Twitter will already have moved on to something else before we realize what it is that we were dealing with. Journalists and media, if they're not laughing at the name Twitter, tend to think of it as just another opportunity to promote the stories that they're writing. The smart ones are using it as a channel, a way to build a network of sources, to ask readers to provide suggestions for questions to ask, and to also recruit them as people who can go and mash up the data that I'm talking about. But the real power of Twitter is in the art of the retweet. In other words, if I send a message and you think that message is interesting enough to be able to send on to your followers, then you will retweet that message. But you will only retweet the valuable material. If I'm putting out rubbish, you won't retweet that. So maybe 99% of what I say you don't think is worth retweeting, but that one act of retweeting lends value to what I've originally said. And if somebody retweets what you've done, that information is then promoted further and further. So the art of the retweet enables us to establish the value, the authenticity, the integrity of the original material And that makes Twitter extremely powerful.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Okay.